now I got a recording message. If you have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll kind of pause, see where we go. If we're running out of time, we might hold some questions to the very end, but we're excited to be here. And our first slide, just a disclaimer that we can't go into individual assessment cases, but if after this presentation you have questions, you can reach out to the person who did the assessment if you've had one done, or reread it with this information in mind. So we'll start off with
Amy, I'm just going to remind, we had a couple of people join, so I'm just going to let them know this is being recorded. So your name and your picture should not show up. But if you want to feel doubly careful, you can change your name by hovering over your picture. Okay.
Thanks, Lisa. Okay, yeah, and I can't see any numbers changing. So I've only got you and a couple select people in my view. Okay, so we'll start off with what is a learning disability. So when you're talking about learning disabilities, you might see this wording, and you might see this wording, and you might see this wording. So there are a lot of regional differences in terminology and diagnosis, even in Canada, so it can reasonably get really, really confusing. So most often in this region, you're going to see learning disability. You might see specific learning disorder. So there's some nuance to what they mean, but generally they're referring to the same thing. So specific unexpected difficulties related to one or more of the ways that a person takes in, stores, or uses information despite intelligence, motivation, and opportunity to learn. So we'll break that down a little bit. We tried to reduce some of the complex language, but it is kind of there's some nuance there. So by unexpected, we mean it's occurring in a kiddo or a person who is where we would expect them to be in terms of their thinking, reasoning, and problem solving skills. And this difficulty is happening despite them trying and engaging appropriately with school. So it'll feel like it doesn't quite make sense that they're struggling. So to expand on this, you'll see average intellectual ability. You'll see that they're struggling to learn. So they're underachieving in courses, or they're achieving where they're supposed to be, but only with a ton of effort, ton of support from like tutors, teachers, parents. It can affect different areas, and you'll see different names depending on the area. So these are less common. They're more common in the US, but dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, those are very popular in the US. They're just talking about the area that's affected by the learning disability. The underlying process that's underlying the difficulty can vary as well. So in an assessment, we want to be able to pinpoint where things are kind of going awry, like what's causing the larger struggle in a particular academic area. They're most often diagnosed in childhood and adolescence, oftentimes when there's points in education where the expectations increase quite a bit. So often in grade 4, that's where a lot of the expectations increase, sometimes in like grade 7 or 8, and sometimes for people even in adulthood, it can be recognized then, but it's a pattern that started a lot earlier. And they are considered lifelong, but their impact may be considered more or less at different points in a person's life, depending on what they're doing, right? So school tends to put a magnifying glass on these kinds of difficulties. Don't despair about it being lifelong. There's lots of things that parents and other people can do to help. I also wanted to take a minute to talk about dyslexia, just because that term is very popular internationally, and there are a lot of foundations looking specifically at dyslexia. So it's a subtype of a learning disability that affects word recognition, spelling, and decoding, which is breaking words into pieces. And it's at least partially due to phonological processing difficulties, so your ability to notice and work with the sound structure of oral language. So in Ontario, the guidance that we're given to follow is to diagnose a learning disability, and then an additional diagnosis of dyslexia can be given. It's not always going to be given. Okay. And what can parents do to help? So this is quite a huge area. There's a lot that's been written on it. This is from sort of the categories that come up from the Learning Disabilities Association of Canada. So there's kind of 4 areas of intervention that are focused on. Parents are probably the most important for these 2 here, so specific skill instruction and encouraging self-advocacy for their child. But there's also developing compensatory strategies and identifying appropriate accommodations at the school level. So when we first started making this presentation, we had an almost endless list of suggestions for parents for different areas that they can support. We cut it down to 3 or 4 per area just to kind of keep it manageable for folks because we don't really know where people are at, like whether they've received a diagnosis or their child has received a diagnosis. So these kind of are a starting point. It's also important to keep in mind the sort of underlying process. So oftentimes that kind of tells us where intervention should happen. And talk to the teacher is at the very top here because teachers are the ones who are working with your child at school, and chances are they're using a particular strategy. And if you can yourself learn that strategy and use it at home, that's going to be extra helpful because they're kind of learning that skill in different places from different people. Um, Lisa, do you want to jump in? Because I know some of these are sort of your
Sure.
wheelhouse.
Sure. And we recognize, you guys are not teacher. Well, maybe some of you are teachers, but we recognize that maybe you're working full time, you're running around to all kinds of things, but these hopefully will be strategies that you can put in place. And someone just asked if you'll have the copy of the slide deck. Um, Usually what we do is ask if you want the slide deck, can you either put your email if you're comfortable into the chat, or you can email one of us at the school board. So Amy, would you mind putting, while I'm chatting, would you mind putting our emails in the chat and then people can email us if they would like the
Yes.
slides? Or can you
I'm,
access it?
I'm not sure that I can. I hid
Okay,
my floating meeting
that's okay. I'll
controls.
do it later when you're talking, and then people can have our emails. Okay. So for reading, some kids might be younger and be part of a kindergarten program, and some kids might be older and be part of a withdrawal program for reading. So if you can chit chat with your teacher and just get 1 or 2 of the strategies that they're using in those programs and use that while you're reading with your kiddo at home. That can be super helpful just in terms of reinforcing the use, or, oh, maybe we can use that strategy now. Um, you can have a little fun with it with the whole family. If you have one kiddo or several, have a letter of the day, have a word of the day or week, and just when you're out and about, point out words that they might know or not know. We're so fortunate, and we'll talk about technology later too, but there are things like visual dictionaries we can use where kids can keep a list of new words, write out the definition, and attach a visual to it. Sometimes that really helps kids with the visual attached to the words. This is a fun little game I just came across when I was reading about, and like when we were preparing for this presentation, is about when you're out and about, you can say, in the car, we used to do I Spy games, or make something out of the license plate in front of us, make a saying out of it. You can do, sitting somewhere waiting for an appointment and say, oh, can you find something in the room that starts with ah or buh or something like that? So play rhyming games at home. So readingrockets.org is a site where you'll find a ton of things you can do. You can go down a rabbit hole on this site because there's so much information there. So try not to do it all and get overwhelmed, because it can be a lot. With regards to, sometimes parents will be frustrated because they hear their kiddo read and they read really well. They read the words really well, but they're struggling with the comprehension part. So it's not until you start asking them questions about what they're reading. So read to your child and have them listen. Ask them questions before they start to read so they can become a more engaged reader. If life is busy and you miss a night and you're not able to read with them, or you miss 3 nights, then they can also listen to books online. one of the most important things that we know about reading is that reading doesn't develop naturally like language, and oral language is an important precursor, like skills like phonological awareness and these kind of terms lead to lead to our readers, but it is a learned skill. Do you want me to keep going with writing and math too, Amy?
Sure, I can jump in for writing and maybe you can do math
Sure. All right.
afterwards. So with
Perfect.
writing, a lot of it is kind of the same thing with reading. They're tied together naturally. But you're kind of getting creative and seeing what a kiddo will engage with. So we talked about printing exercises that focus on areas of interest, or you can write notes back and forth. We were talking once about a kiddo who liked to watch YouTube videos and just having them write a sentence about the YouTube video. When they are writing, particularly as they get further along, using graphic organizers for parts of the story or parts of an essay that come together. That's where proofreading strategies like scope, and I had to Google this again to remind myself what they are. So spelling, capitalization, order of words, punctuation, and express a complete thought. So for a youth or a person who's not finding this intuitive, those kind of step-by-step strategies can be really helpful to slow them down and help them get there. Because for other people, it's this kind of an automatic process. Um, and reading written work aloud, oftentimes kiddos who are struggling with writing, their oral skills or oral expression are okay. So they can say what they want aloud and scribe it and then read it back and edit that way. So kind of taking advantage of skills in other areas. We'll talk more about that. Lisa, is there anything else you want to add for writing?
No, I just want to advocate for spell check because
Yeah.
I'm not a great speller. So it's a blessing for me. I use it all the time. And, sometimes when words are really poor and not even close for spell check to notice them, then there are other assistive technology things that we're going to talk about a bit later that can be helpful. And then math, I think, similarly, you can incorporate math into an everyday task. I know my son would say to me, I'm not sure why we're learning this. When am I ever going to use this? And so showing them that, when you grocery shop or when you get change or saving for an Xbox, for example, can be really helpful and a practical way to include math. Manipulatives is a fancy way of saying visual, concrete things. If you have some extra pennies laying around or macaroni, use other visuals like number lines so that kids can count. I know when my son was learning subtraction, he could not get his head around borrowing and where all the where that went. And as soon as I used some macaroni and he could see the visual part of that, it clicked. So sometimes, seeing that concretely is super helpful. There's games that you can play. Card games often require counting. There's a neat game like 101 and out, which means you roll dice and then you add up or multiply whatever skill you're working on to 101. And then, and if it's a younger kiddo, you can do to 10 to 20, whatever works. I got a question here. Typing's more common to the next generation. Is it possible that not learning to write might not really be a disability? That's an interesting question. I think there's mixed views on that. I know 100% if I had to handwrite my reports for my job, I would be very, very much behind. Um, but there, and if you look at different documents, there is a certain level of handwriting or printing or ability to use that skill in order to fill out a form. Perhaps now you might argue some of them are online, but I think that there's still quite a chunk of learning and writing that goes on in schools. I mean, maybe in another generation, maybe we won't be printing at all. But I think at this point in time, it's still a skill that we assess and look at. Anything to add there, Amy?
No,
For
I thought your answer,
okay.
I thought yours was great. I was also thinking too, like the distinction between like the fine motor difficulties of writing versus like the sort of larger conceptual challenge there. So like difficulties with handwriting, so common, fine motor difficulties also common, especially for like kiddos with ADHD and stuff. Um, that's kind of different versus when they're writing something that's word processed and they're still having issues with things like the proofreading and spell check and those kind of things. Okay, so any more questions in the chat, Lisa, before we pop?
Nope, nope, we're good
Okay,
there.
we'll keep going. Um, Parents can also, like, non-academically, right? So as we kind of talked about, managing our expectations for what we can do if we're not teachers. So I myself am not a teacher. Um, Encouraging self-advocacy. So for kiddos who do have a diagnosis, like them learning what that means and what that doesn't mean. So it does, like, it means that they are smart because you need to have that average intellectual functioning in order to have this diagnosis. So them practicing saying things like, I have a learning disability in this area, and in order to help with that, I need X, Y, and Z. So helping them to know what's also in their IEP if they have one. So if they have a learning disability, chances are they have an IEP in place that has different accommodations. So if they know what they need, then it can help them if they're working with like a new teacher or a substitute teacher who doesn't kind of know how to help them. And I think we can imagine how anxiety provoking it is for a lot of kiddos if it's a new teacher who doesn't know what you need and the rest of the class starts working and you need to get your Chromebook or something like that. So that kind of self-advocacy skill is going to help them continue to access the curriculum in those kind of situations. And normalizing, like, everybody has strengths and weaknesses, right? So like we do think of learning disabilities as more than just being quote unquote bad at math or bad at reading, like those kind of things, but everybody has things that they're dealing with, and it doesn't mean anything negative about them. We went back and forth. So the other one is developing compensatory strategies. So naturally, all of us having strengths and weaknesses will sometimes use one skill set to help us out in another area, right? So for a kiddo, Lisa, I don't know if you want to chime in. You were talking about uh, the difficulty with breaking down like the sounds in the word, but you can memorize the whole word. And so you just kind of use that advanced memory to support that. But we don't want to eliminate certain skills or not give someone the opportunity to learn how to read or to write or to do math because they are finding it hard to do, right? Because those are important skills to have. So, like, developing compensatory strategies is typical and normal and should be encouraged, but not to the detriment of learning the basic skill.
Yeah, I think so. I think, with reading, some kids will use the context of the story to figure out a word. That's great. It doesn't mean that we don't try to help them to learn to sound out words, but those compensatory things are important. And I think no one's good at everything, and we all use compensatory strategies every once in a while. I don't know many people who would do their taxes and write out all the calculations by hand, right? We use a computer or a calculator or whatever. So I think
Yes,
that's, yeah.
exactly. And it shows actually like really great reasoning and thinking skills when people develop compensatory strategies, like they're automatically kind of filling in a blank there. Okay, appropriate accommodations. So if you don't have an IEP in place for a kiddo with a learning disability, ask whether one should be written. Actually reading it, sometimes they're a little bit tricky and sometimes you're like, oh, this doesn't sound quite right. Like, parents can participate in the development and ongoing review. I believe in the school board, they're required to sign off on them as well. So you should be getting this information. Um, there are lots of potential accommodations. They should be linked to the struggle that the kiddo is having. So you don't want to just start throwing random things in there because it sounds like it could be helpful, right? The point of an accommodation isn't necessarily to make things easier. So accommodations are useful when the learning disability affects a child's ability to learn information or to show what they know in another subject area. So I often give the example of a learning disability in the area of reading and how it could affect a math test. So if there are word problems, it may take them longer to read and understand that word problem. So in that case, we might give them more time, or you might have someone read the question aloud to them. So in that case, we want to see their math skills, not their reading skills. So it makes sense to accommodate. Same thing for like a short answer on a science test, and the young person has a learning disability in the area of written expression. It's not about making things easier. It's about setting the child up to be able to access the information and show what they know. With accommodations, the curriculum and the expectations don't change at all. It's different than modifications where someone's modified to a different grade level. Anything you want to add on that, Lisa?
I think that sometimes, when we hear, oh, somebody's or somebody or something like the computer is going to read something to my kiddo, it's like, oh, well, is that cheating? And I think it's the same as, if I took my glasses off right now and I tried to read small print, it wouldn't happen. So I think, like Amy said, it's when you want to know what they really know, you're not making them take off their glasses and answer a question or do math. But there is still a balance. We don't just maybe always give them, we're also giving them assistive technology, but we're also still working on those basic building block skills to read. So it's kind of a balance, but like I said before, without my computer, my reports would not get finished. It would just be too arduous and long for me to do. So we have some great technology that is super helpful, and so it's a wonderful addition to the whole well-rounded kind of education.
100%. Okay, so, oh, this is Lisa's slide. I'll let you just take it, Lisa.
Okay, this slide is basically to say a couple of things. And one thing is this poor kiddo, goes to school 5 days a week, 6 hours a day, and then comes home and does more schoolwork. It can be really hard. Some kids need to come home and have a rest. Some kids who find school difficult are exhausted by the end of the day. And parents will also often ask, oh, should I get my child a tutor? I want them to, do their reading and their writing and their math. And I think it's a balance again. If they're exhausted and then you run out the door to do tutoring, how helpful will it be? If after they have a rest or on a Saturday or a Sunday, maybe, you have to take into consideration your kiddo. And I think what happens with the poor little kid on the right hand side is you get tears, you get upset, you get frustration, either because they're just too tired or they don't want to do schoolwork all the time. So I think part of the being a well-rounded human is, yeah, maybe math is hard, but what other things are you good at, And extracurriculars can be exceedingly expensive, but perhaps there's ones that you can do together that can just add another area of interest. Doing crafts, go to a skating rink, play fun hockey, those kind of things, so they can develop other skills to feel good about those other areas that they're good at. Um, I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, and I think this is useful for basically any presentation. We talked about the ratio of positive to negative feedback or corrective feedback, right? So if a kiddo's struggling in any area, they're getting a lot of corrective feedback. And for every piece of corrective feedback, you want to be giving 4 pieces of positive feedback, right? And sometimes that means searching for things, realizing that things are harder for a particular kid, right? So you did a great job of writing out your letters. You did a great job of spacing your words, those kinds of things. I think our next
You have a
slide.
question,
Oh, of
actually. Maybe can I jump in now? Is it a good time?
course, yeah.
So sometimes we try some accommodations, they're not working. What are the next steps? In elementary school, I would say that if you've tried things and you're in the classroom, let's say, and you're struggling, or the parents notice like, geez, there hasn't been a lot of growth, then that's a time perhaps to take a kiddo to your school-based team meeting, and then to get some suggestions. And then after that, you can also bring your kiddo to the multidisciplinary team meeting, where there's a whole bunch of different people like myself or Amy sit on some MDSTs. multidisciplinary school support teams, or speech and language pathologists and so on, so that you can get some more information. The other thing is that if a kiddo has a diagnosis of a learning disability, there should be a psychological assessment in their OSR and their Ontario student record. And so look back at that, ask your multidisciplinary team if you could have a psychologist come and talk about it and say what you've tried, and then work through it that way. I think there's one new message too. So that's what I would suggest doing. Yeah, and if there's, I would say, if there's undue frustration and it's impacting the class, reach out and get some suggestions and some supports from that school team and multidisciplinary team. I'm just looking. So someone asked about an IPRC. So I know it's 12:45. If people have to go, if their lunch break's over, that's fine. We will continue for a few more minutes and then sign off shortly. So the benefits of an IPRC meeting. Okay.
I'm gonna close this so I can see. Now I'm
Yeah.
curious.
Okay, you can stop sharing. We do have some recommendations in the slides for resources. Do you want to just show that slide while I'm talking a bit, Amy? And then
Sorry,
so
I've got myself stuck now.
that's
I
okay.
can't unshare.
The IPRC, or you can just, I can put them in the chat too, Amy. Perfect. So the IPRC meeting stands for Identification, Placement, and Review Committee. And that identifies kids as having exceptionalities in learning, anywhere from an intellectual difficulty to autism, to learning disability, to behavioral difficulties, and so on. And this will vary in different school boards. But in our school board, we tend to not do IPRCs unless the kiddo is going to be placed in a different setting. So for example, if a kiddo is in a classroom in mainstream and they have a learning disability and they apply and are lucky enough to get into one of our learning disabled settings, then they would be IPRC'd into that other setting. Where I would place my where I'd put my eggs in the basket is around the IEP. The IEP, the Individual Education Plan, is really where the accommodations are that are designed to support your kiddo in the classroom, and that's where I think things would be better focused. If kiddos have intellectual challenges, then we do have settings for that as well. And again, it's an application process, and those programs are wonderful for kids who fit the appropriate profile, and it would go through a selection team to make sure that those programs suit the needs of the kiddos. I hope that answers that question. I don't see any follow-ups. Thanks very much for coming to these. I hope the recording worked. Sometimes we have challenges. If we do, maybe we'll do another recording just without anybody here so it can be accessible. I have 2 email addresses to send the slides out to, which I will do. Thank God for the recordings. We're trying. So we will make that happen. So yeah, as I said, I have 2 emails, so we will send that out, and I put our emails in the chat. So if you guys want to email us, we can send out the slides to you guys. Oh, and we got another one. Okay, so I will not close the meeting until I write down everybody's address, because we lost them once. So thanks everybody. Amy, any
Thank you,
final
everyone.
comments? Anything you want to say about the resources or anything?
Nope. But I think we talked about this earlier. It's kind of interesting. A lot of the research has been focused around reading. So you may notice it's relatively easier to access resources for that particular skill. Like math is a little less research. So if you're finding that, you're not alone, like there's a bit of a gap there that needs to be filled.
For sure.